Hello, everybody. Doing our second show here for the day, joined by Professor Michael Breidenbach. How are you, Dr. Breidenbach? Great to have
Excellent, Michael. Thank you.
you. Excellent. Yes, and I understand you're professor and chair of history at Ave Maria University.
That's right. That's right.
Awesome. And you are also the author of Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America. It was released May 2021. Is that right?
That's right.
Recent publication here. So this is going to be an exciting topic, talking about this book here, because this is not a topic we've really addressed a whole lot. I did have Professor Thomas Pink on the show where we
Mhm.
spoke about Dignitatis Humanae and its implications on religious liberty, but we didn't really dive into um, American history and the idea of religious toleration in it being something that belongs especially to Catholics. I mean, we generally think of those things as being Protestant in nature. And as I understand it, your book kind of brings out the fact that this is actually something that's native to Catholics. Is that correct?
That's right. I think from a very early stage in American colonial life, we find debates about church-state relations, questions of religious tolerance, what to do with religious dissenters, and in particular, what to do with Catholics, papists, those who were deemed disloyal simply by being Catholic because of their inherent relationship to the Pope and for other reasons. As John Locke would say, they believe in irrational, superstitious beliefs as well. But mostly it was because of their tie to the Holy See. And when we think about Dignitatis Humanae, we often have theological or philosophical debates about this, but there's a history here that needs to be uncovered. And this is just one slice of it. I think the American experiment in religious liberty is a particularly important one. And it's often been told as a Protestant story. And what I do in the book is show the way in which Catholics were at the table in these discussions and in this lived experiment of religious toleration and later liberty. And so I know Tom Pink well, and I had him over at Ave Maria University a few years ago on the 50th anniversary of Dignitatis Humanae. And we had a really productive conversation because oftentimes theologians, philosophers, and historians don't talk to each other about this critical issue. We speak today, tomorrow, the President of the United States, the second Catholic president, is going to meet Pope Francis. And so this is an enduring sort of question about the role that Catholics have in America and some of the tensions that present themselves.
And let me just reiterate, because I noticed for some reason I hit the live button, but it did not go live for the first minute. So everybody probably missed your name, even though we have it on the screen. Let me just reintroduce you. We have Professor Michael Breidenbach here, professor and chair of history at Ave Maria University. We're discussing his book, Our Dear Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America, just released earlier this year in May. I want to encourage everybody to go and get a copy. I put a link to it there in the description. So go and check out and get your own copy of it. Now, I want to go ahead and just dive in. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to write this book.
So, Michael, I'm a cradle Catholic, which means that from a very young age, I sat in pews and observing, obviously, from a very young age, the smells and bells of Catholicism, but also observing two objects to the right and left of the altar. And I'm not talking about statues, I'm talking about flags. I'm talking about the American flag and the flag of the Holy See. And what struck me as I grew up was the way in which they, in every parish that I went to, had a kind of perfect equipoise, right? As if like these two flags belong there. They sort of flank, right, the liturgy, and as if this is, a perfectly compatible, almost just so story. And when I went to graduate school at the University of Cambridge, maybe away from the United States, I had this sort of opportunity to examine that American Catholic compatibility thesis, right? On what levels is it possible, right, or even desirable, right, to have this kind of compatibility? And on what areas might there be incompatibility or at least tensions. And one of the ways I look at that, I'm trained as an historian, American political, religious, and legal history. And one of the ways I wanted to look at that was historically. There are vigorous debates going on right now among Catholics about this question. They're often philosophical and political conversations, as well as theological. But rarely does a historian stand up and say, look, there is a way to examine this question historically to see how Catholics, from a very early stage in America, right, the colonial era in particular, in the British context, how they understood their dual identities, right, in the face of great controversy, as I'm sure we'll talk about. So in a way, it's a history of early America, but it's also my coming to terms with, right, my American and Catholic identity, in fact. And I did so in Britain. And I think that was important because so much of these early histories are British histories, right? The book covers about 200 years of history, and the first, 100 years or so, actually the first 150 years, is English or British. So it's important to recognize how much of this is an English story before it becomes a distinctly American.
That's an interesting point. I remember I was reading a little bit. I think it was Benjamin Franklin. This was before, if I recall correctly, before the American Revolution. And he was writing letters. I forget who it was to, but it was one of his letters. And he says, I am a Briton, in it explicitly, while he's, colonial. So he's explicitly referring to himself as a Briton. So it's interesting that Americans actually saw themselves, it seems, at least in that early stage, as Britons.
Right. My student the other day, I'm teaching a course on the age of revolutions, so comparing the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. And one of my students emailed me a meme that he saw on Instagram, which, that's our students all. And he sent to me hoping I would laugh, and I did, because it was a kind of cartoon in which it said, "The British are coming. The British are coming."
Right.
And someone opens the window and says, "We are British, you idiot."
Right.
They understood themselves exactly as Britons, and they wanted the full rights and privileges as Britons, and they didn't feel like they had that, and that's one of the major reasons why they wanted to rebel and declare independence eventually.
So tell me the bulk or the meat of the book. What's the biggest thing that you're really wanting us to take away from it?
The main thesis is quite simple, which is that Catholics became American by declaring independence from the Pope. And what I mean by that is Catholics were deemed dangerous, right, in their own country. They were considered almost outlaws in their own country. You can look at the penal laws against Catholics and see the extent to which they were not allowed to move around the country very much. Some laws stipulate that you can only go so many miles outside of your home. Priests were declared illegal, and if caught as performing as priests, they would be fined and later imprisoned or even executed. There were laws against sending your children to Catholic schools, and so on. Obviously, they couldn't vote or hold public office. And so in that kind of context, it's really surprising that Catholics are able to not only receive civil and religious liberty at the American founding, but they were even allowed to be at the table of finalizing the text of the First Amendment. And that a Catholic was even the first one to write the first history of the First Amendment. This is a journalist who wrote the congressional proceedings during the First Federal Congress as they were debating the First Amendment. So how did this possible? I mean, this is a remarkable transformation, right? To go from suspected subjects to trusted citizens. And the answer is that they answered the two main problems politically with Catholicism. I mean, there were lots of other problems with the Catholicism, theologically, doctrinally, and so on. But the two main political problems were having to do with the Pope, right? First, the Pope is considered to be infallible on faith and morals, and sometimes Protestants even said beyond faith and morals, right? And the second is the Pope had the power to intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries. And so if you denied those two things, then you were a politically palatable Catholic, right? Because you didn't present yourself as potentially dangerous to the state. And so Protestants, like John Locke, for instance, but even before him, he's the most sort of well-known figure, but many people said that Catholics presented themselves as a kind of, or Catholicism presented itself as a kind of imperium in imperio, right? A state within a state. Sure, you could have your allegiance to Britain, but when it came down to it, you're going to follow the Pope with his anathemas and his excommunication threats and all the rest. And so ultimately, you're going to side with a foreign external power. And that's intolerable. And that's exactly what John Locke says. It's exactly what the laws in Britain suggested. And many in America in the colonial times had these kind of anti-Catholic impulses as well. So what I show in the book is how Catholics effectively deny these two beliefs about papal authority. And these are very prominent Catholic figures. I mean, they're not household names necessarily like George Washington or John Adams, but Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only signer of the Declaration of Independence who was Catholic. His second cousin, Bishop John Carroll, the first bishop of the Ordinary Diocese of Baltimore. His brother, Daniel Carroll, a constitutional framer. And then before that, the Lords Baltimore, the founders of Maryland, and many other minor figures, all of whom believed that the Pope was not infallible by himself and did not have the power to intervene in political affairs of other countries.
Now, how does that work, especially with, unum sanctum and things like that? It seems like that, wouldn't be the case. It seems like, in fact, that the Pope would have authority over the temporal world and the temporal sphere, including territories that aren't necessarily his own. How would Catholics have responded to that in America?
Well, I open the book with chapter 1, Papist Royalists, in which I show Pope Alexander's impressively comprehensive papal bull, which divides the world into two halves, right? Spanish and Portuguese. And any country that, or authority or power that wanted to settle in either hemisphere would have to get the permission either of Spain or Portugal. So the Spanish Pope gave Spain, right, the Americas. And anyone who wanted to settle in these cases had to get Spain's permission or face the wrath of God and ipso facto excommunication. I mean, it's very clear in the papal bull. This is exactly where the first Lord Baltimore, George Calvert, settled in English colonies. He was Catholic. He didn't heed the papal bull on this matter. And it's true that many times these English Catholics and American Catholics would be presented with the argument, right, that this has been a kind of practice of the popes previously, that they intervene in the temporal affairs of other countries. So, for instance, the annulment of Magna Carta in the English context, the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth I, the annulment of the Oath of Allegiance of 1606, and we should probably talk about that oath in particular. All these things are, as it were, interventions in political affairs of England in particular, or the very settlement of the American colonies with regard to so-called Spanish territory declared by the Pope. All these are interventions. Now, as you know, the justification for these interventions was what Cardinal Bellarmine called indirect temporal power. That is to say, the Pope is not, or should not anyway, be intervening in the political affairs of other countries for the sake of political or temporal ends, but rather for the sake of spiritual ends.
Okay.
Right? The remission of sins or the salvation of souls or mitigating some evil, right? in a country, like schism, in the case of England, as they saw with Elizabeth I. And so in all these cases, it was always understood as a spiritual authority that did have temporal or political consequences, to be sure, but that would be well within the ambit, these theologians like Bellarmine argued, well within the ambit of the Pope's plenitude of spiritual power. So these English Catholics simply denied that, and they instead sourced their theological and jurisprudential views on the conciliarist tradition, starting in the 14th century.
Now, is it a mistake on my part to say that wasn't there this notion that even the Pope could actually indirectly overthrow a government insofar as he could say, this king is now eligible for regicide because of this or that abuse? You could actually overthrow him and you don't have to be obedient to him for this or that reason. Did the Pope have such a power? And if so, wouldn't that have implications on its relations to the American government? Of course, we don't have a king, but still the
Right.
principle
Yeah.
would still apply
Any
to the
political
government.
authority.
Right. Yeah.
That had been the main argument of previous popes and the theologians that supported what I'll call papalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
This kind of view that argues that the Pope's plenitude of spiritual power does have the effect of fairly severe political consequences, like
Mm-hmm.
the deposition of a king,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, or a queen.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wouldn't be as if the Pope would send an army with him as general going into England and so on. Of course, he would task Catholic countries to do that, or something like that, or simply state that one does not have to obey this sovereign anymore. Like,
Right.
your oath is hereby abrogated. And so that was the great fear, and that's what brings us to 1606, where I begin the book. In terms of George Calvert, James I, King James, promulgated this oath of allegiance after Guy Fawkes tried to assassinate him and parliamentarians. He was a Catholic, conspirator, effectively a would-be assassin. And after that horrendous event, James I has this oath demanded of anyone who's tendered it, but particularly, obviously, aiming at Catholics. And James I said that he wanted to distinguish between good and bad Catholics. In other words, the good Catholics are the ones who say that they are fully allegiant to James and his successors, and they do not believe in the damnable doctrines, right, that we've just articulated, right, that the Pope can absolve oaths, that the Pope can excommunicate, and therefore create a situation where you don't have to obey the monarch, or even murder, right, the monarch for this religious schism, and so on. And so the Pope said that anyone who signed or swore this oath would be excommunicated. And so this created a huge problem for English Catholics, right? You can either be considered a traitor or excommunicated from your church.
Mm.
And so what I show in the book, in the first part, is the way in which English Catholics tried to get around this oath and the threat of excommunication. And so it's a very clever strategy that they tried to use, and actually were successful in it insofar as Maryland was founded and Catholics came to it. But to your point, yes, that's exactly the problem, the political problem of Catholicism, that it presents a kind of political theology in which the Pope can overthrow governments, to put it simply. Although it's the mechanics of that is much more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be the perceived threat, right? That's the specter that creates a lot of fear among Protestants, and indeed Catholics, who don't support this view either, right?
Mm.
For instance, the Gallican tradition in France.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the the papalist versus conciliarist debates of the Middle Ages and early modern period that does have implications for the American story.
You had spoken about how some viewed American Catholics with suspect, all right, and to me, it seems like this continued for a long time, even into the '60s, if I recall correctly. I obviously wasn't alive in the '60s, but according to history, from
Right.
what the little I know of it, it seems like Catholics, whenever JFK was elected, since of course he was a Catholic, a lot of people were concerned. Okay, well, what kind of implications does this have? Because he's under the Pope, but he's also the president. So, where's his loyalty going to be? It seems that that suspicion lasted as far as even the '60s. Is that correct?
That's right. I think you can see a kind of ebb and flow of anti-Catholicism in American history. I think that the period that I end the book with, the early 19th century, is a great kind of interlude of tolerance and even acceptance of Catholics. When you have a rise of immigrants, particularly from Germany and Ireland, that had a kind of rise of ultramontanism, you begin to see more anti-Catholicism in especially major cities like Philadelphia and so on, in which it's a combination of your kind of reliable anti-Catholic rhetoric, along with anti-immigrant sentiment as well, and so and that continues in the 19th century, and I think by the time we get to John F. Kennedy, there is a great revival of hope among Catholics that they will be considered fully American finally, especially with his election. But you're right, John F. Kennedy had to deal with that as presidential candidate in 1960, his famous speech to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. It's an association of Protestants. He gave a very famous speech in which he says, effectively, I do not speak for my church, and the Pope doesn't speak for me, right? I am the one who swears an oath not to anyone, especially not the Pope, right, but to the Constitution. And so he wanted to create a very stark separation of church and state that echoes Al Smith when he also ran for president. That was the governor of New York, who was Catholic. And so this is pretty much the reliable strategy that American Catholics, especially those in public life, use. They say, I believe in the absolute separation of church and state. The Pope does not have the kind of authority that you should be worried about, right? He can inform my conscience, but my conscience, as it were, is my own. It's between me and God, and I swear an oath to no one but to a document, right? To uphold the Constitution and its laws. And so that kind of separation of church and state idea, but also this idea that the Pope does not have that kind of authority in temporal affairs, is very much the strategy that the earliest Catholics used in Maryland and elsewhere in the colonial period.
Speaking here about separation of church and state, I mean, there are those who give this very, clear split between the two in America. Talk to me a little bit about how you maybe address this in your book. What American Catholics, what exactly was their view here? Because it seems like the idea of separating church from state, greatly would be in contrast with how the Catholic Church has operated for quite a long time. So could you maybe touch on that?
Yeah, I think what these American Catholics are suggesting is novel. And, you look at the practice and the theory in Catholic countries and papal documents and so on. It's very clear that according to sort of standard church practice and doctrine, church-state unity is considered the ideal. In fact, even as late as the 19th century, Leo XIII in Immortality Dei, right, talks about the church and state as a kind of soul-body unity, right? And so that had been, a very standard view. And so what these American Catholics are proposing is quite unique. And and yet the Holy See tolerates it. And the reason why they do so is, and it takes a while for them to even understand what's going on in what they call the United Provinces of America. I mean, the very idea of sort of United States of America for them is novel. But what Bishop John Carroll does is show the way in which this kind of juridical separation of church and state is effectively the best the United States can do vis-a-vis Catholicism. I mean, there's no chance. I mean, Catholics are 1%, if that, of the population by the time of the U.S. Constitution. So there's no chance that it'll ever be a Catholic confessional state. But what it allows, though, is what Carroll argues is a kind of libertas ecclesiae, right? The Catholic Church is allowed to govern itself just like any other church. And having its own disciplines and so on, as so long as Catholics obey the laws. Now, of course, that's the central tension, right? To what extent are the laws and teachings of Catholicism in unison, or at least some kind of compatibility with American law?
I think of during the Prohibition there,
Right.
being able to use actual wine during
Right.
the consecration. I just kind of wonder how that went down with being within the law.
Yeah, it's a kind of exemption, right, from a generally applicable law, right, that you cannot sort of manufacture or sell alcoholic beverages. And so there was, I mean, a lot of Catholics did actually support prohibition. Unfortunately, the ravages of alcohol did affect some Catholic communities quite hard. And so, bishops, I mean, you can see the documents, bishops are quite laudatory of prohibition in some ways. But to go back to the central question of, church and state separation, what American Catholics are proposing is unique, but the way they persuade Rome on this is they look at the fruits, right? Look at the way in which the Catholic Church is able to operate freely. We have an equal standing in law, and we're able to continue evangelization and incorporation of churches, and there are missions and convents popping up, and there's great growth. And so when Leo XIII again talks about the American experiment, he acknowledges all that, right? He acknowledges that John Carroll was friends with George Washington, that Catholicism showed great growth in America. He also says, of course, that it would be a mistake to conclude, therefore, that church and state should be dissevered and divorced as it is in America. Right? He still held to the kind of ideal of church-state unity, but he saw in America that kind of secularity could accrue great benefits for the church, absent any kind of ideal instantiation. So I think that story, the 19th and 20th century shows the way in which Catholicism did flourish, despite the states and the federal government not giving it preferential treatment. In some ways, the very opposite of preferential treatment. So I think America has a lot to offer, as it were, by way of contrast. But that's more or less on the level of practicalities, right? We really haven't gotten to as it were, the theoretical views of church and state. So how did they justify that? Well, they relied on the kind of conclusions of the conciliarist movement, right? So if you could say that the Pope does not have the power to intervene in temporal affairs, you're getting a kind of jurisdictional view of church and state, rather than the kind of metaphysical view that you see in Bellarmine's work, for instance, right? Bellarmine, starts with this kind of premise about how the soul is greater than the body, and the church is analogously the soul, and the state is the body, and so on and so forth. Whereas the jurists, I'm thinking of like John of Paris of the 14th century, exactly the time of Unum Sanctum, is arguing for a kind of jurisdictional view of church and state. It's not quite the American context by any stretch, but I would say that when John Courtney Murray reads John of Paris in his articles in the Theological Studies Journal, he effectively says that John of Paris of the 14th century solved our modern church-state problem. I mean, he saw the conciliarist kind of jurisdictional view as something of a kind of prototype for what the Americans did many centuries later. Now, this is, I'm arguing historically, how Catholics become American, right? They deny these two papal authorities, and they're able to persuade Rome of the kind of effective church-state juridical separation with a lot of cooperation. But, the fact remains that, Leo XIII's view is not instantiated in America, right? So the question then after Vatican I is this strategy tenable, right? After papal infallibility is declared as dogma, what resources do the kind of American Catholic conciliarist strategy have left, right, to show their compatibility?
That's a question that I'd like an answer to. I'd love to hear more, because that's exactly what I was wondering. I mean, how does this work now that Gallicanism and conciliarism has been condemned with Vatican I? I mean, what's left?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Michael, because if you ask sort of your ordinary American Catholic, I think, what do you think of papal infallibility is? How many times it's been invoked, and so on. I think they'll have a pretty circumscribed view of it, right? Yeah. And so, I think the reality is that it doesn't rise to the level of great controversy anymore, maybe in part because of Vatican I, right? I mean, in other words, Vatican I had the kind of final debate about it, and there was a kind of aftermath that was quite vigorous. But conciliarism, as you say, right, it's in the ash heap of heresy. And so what do you do with papal infallibility now? Well, you say it isn't invoked very much, right? You say it's a kind of power that the Pope can use, but prudentially won't really. And likewise with indirect temporal power, right? This idea that the Pope can intervene in the political affairs of other countries. I mean, notice how when Pope Francis came to the United States, under the Obama administration, and spoke for the first ever papal address to a joint session of Congress. Notice how, in the press releases and briefings before that great event, the Obama administration wanted to quell any kind of concern that the Pope would be acting like a politician, right? And so I think it was Ben Rhodes of the Obama administration said, look, the Pope is a pastor, not a politician. And, anyone who has read sort of Catholic medieval and early modern history knows that he's both. And he's head of state, and he's a pastor par excellence. He's a universal pastor. And so, in fact, what Pope Francis did was speak as a pastor, but also someone who had a kind of political edge to it, right? He talked about immigration. He talked about the environment. He talked about life issues. And so what we have, of course, is, by the very presence of a Pope in the Congress, a kind of political intervention, right? And we saw this with John Paul II, with the fall of communism. We saw it in World War II when the Pope was very quiet, but quite insistent on being involved at a high level with potential assassination plots against Adolf Hitler. So, the popes have exercised this kind of indirect temporal authority even as recent as the 21st century. So I think that presents itself a problem for American Catholics at a kind of theoretical level, you might say, because if you look at the naturalization oath, it says, I will abjure all allegiances to any prince, potentate, right, state, or sovereignty, which is almost word for word the oath language from anti-Catholic oaths from English history. And it's the same oath that's been since 1795 in America. And so if you have to renounce all your loyalties, right, does that include, right, this kind of temporal allegiance that Catholics have been considered to have with the Pope? That is to say, if the Pope says something about political affairs, then you have to obey, right? Now, I think there's a kind of toleration, you might call it, of the way in which popes have intervened in political affairs. You know, the fall of communism, I think most Americans would have supported that, right? And so it doesn't rise to the level of great controversy. But, you know, if Pope Francis tomorrow says to Joe Biden, you know, look, you have to make sure that Roe versus Wade is overturned, and all the, you know, Mexico City policy and all these benefits to Planned Parenthood and so on and so forth, right? All these things have to go, Mr. President, right? Then you would have a controversy. Right? You won't have that though, because you know, popes have been quite prudent in many respects on exercising this kind of indirect temporal authority. And again, the way in which papal infallibility is understood by most Americans is that it's so circumscribed that it's effectively or politically irrelevant. So it's a kind of, you know, practical toleration of these beliefs, I think, at this point.
You know, shifting gears here just slightly, there is this term Americanism that you know, probably comes up in this discussion. What exactly is Americanism as far as a heresy, and how does it relate to, you know, what you're addressing in your book?
Yeah, so Americanism has the unfortunate or the fortune of being so broad that everyone throws it around, right? And it becomes this kind of sticking point in conversations. But the unfortunate, the misfortune of being very ill-defined. And so it's a term of opprobrium that from the 19th century, but it's also a term of praise by Blessed Fulton Sheen in the 20th century, right? He calls himself Americanist, right? And what he means by that is, you know, someone who believes in kind of the American ideals that he finds completely compatible with the Catholic Church. He's speaking, of course, in the context of sort of a Cold War and so on. But, you know, the Americanist controversy is actually quite complicated because it involved many different figures in the American hierarchy, but also in France. And so I think we'll just simply say Americanism has become a kind of floating sign, as it were, of all that is wrong with America, right? And in particular, it has to do with this notion of church-state separation, right? But also the way in which you know, Americans understand their liberty, that they can, as it were, decide for themselves, right? Church practice, disciplines in particular, and sometimes even doctrines. So there's a kind of fear of a kind of creeping, as it were, vision of Protestantism that's lurking when people throw around this term, I think. And so some people have seen the history that I've detailed and said, yeah, these American Catholics were Americanists, right? And obviously that's an anachronism, right? Because this term was sort of coined in the 19th century. But what they mean by that is they sort of bite the hard critique of you know, some people who believe in a kind of private judgment with regard to Catholicism.
And I want to address two other things before we get to the chat questions, but y'all go ahead and send them. Make sure to send it to @Reason and Theology so I can pick them out from the comments. But yeah, go ahead and start posting them now. Switching gears once again, I want to talk just a little bit about speech and the freedom of speech and how this relates to your book. You know, it seems like the Catholic Church with the Index of Forbidden Books has somewhat limited speech in some contexts, and it seems like some popes have had a whole lot to say about this. How did that relate to Catholics in America who would seem to have, have been tempted to go with more of an American understanding of freedom of speech?
So the freedom of speech doesn't come up as much in the debates of the First Federal Congress with regard to the Catholics who were present there, Daniel Carroll and Charles Carroll. And for them, what's, as it were, more important is to make sure that their civil and religious liberty is secured. And what they mean by that is they can practice Catholicism freely, the church can sort of govern itself independently, and that they're able to continue to hold public office and vote and hold property and send their children to Catholic schools and all the rest, right? In other words, be sort of reliable members of citizens of the United States. Speech, for them, is part of what it is to be a kind of lowercase Republican, right? To be part of the grand conversation in newspapers and pamphlets and all the rest. And in my reading of the early American period, there's very little suppression of Catholic speech in that respect, right? So John Carroll pens several articles in newspapers arguing against religious tests for public office. He does so anonymously or pseudonymously, not because he fears reprisal necessarily, but because he's a cleric, right? And he doesn't want to be seen as a priest to have this kind of untoward or undue intervention in political affairs. But he thinks it's obviously part of what it is for religious liberty, right? For Catholics to serve in this capacity. So Catholics are able to write articles, publish pamphlets, speak in the sidewalk, and all the rest. I think speech becomes much more important as a kind of, in terms of case law, later on, especially in the 20th century, when everything is reduced to speech. Religion is reduced to speech. Sometimes and art is reduced to speech. Expression, right? It becomes expression. And I think that's a great disservice, just philosophically, the way in which we understand these distinct entities. My wife, who's a philosopher at Ave Maria University, is writing a book on this, the way in which we should philosophically understand the First Amendment as speech, assembly, and religion. These are very distinct actions, right, that have their own justification for them. So I think speech is not very much a problem for Catholics at this point. They're generally able to publish and speak and express their views in the public square. What they want to make sure, though, is that the state laws that prevent them from holding public office, at sometimes voting, and having kind of the holdovers of English penal laws against Catholics, that to be expunged. And so they can live in relative peace in these other states like New York and so on.
Now, in the last few minutes, I want to briefly talk about religious liberty, especially in light of the Second Vatican Council with Dignitatis Humanae. How does that factor in with your book?
So I think you can see, I think in an exaggerated way, a kind of straight line from the founding of Maryland, in which these English Catholics created a colony that tolerated both Protestants and Catholics, and created a kind of juridical separation of church and state, which didn't have an established church, to Dignitatis Humanae, right, in which the doctrine of religious liberty in 1965 was articulated in clear and profound ways that the church had not done authoritatively before. At the same time, I want to sort of backpedal a little bit, because, of course, Dignitatis Humanae is grounded on a theological conception of the human person, right? Created in the image and likeness of God, and it's a very teleological, right, view of religious liberty. That is to say, there is a one true faith that everyone ought to hold, and the freedom is for people to find that faith, right? To find God, the true God, and the true church. That's the picture of Dignitatis Humanae. And that's the reason for allowing for religious liberty, right? It's to, as it were, provide the conditions for finding the true faith. It's also resting in a theological conception of the dignity of the human person. That is to say that even if someone doesn't find the true church and the true God, that religious liberty is still good because it's grounded in a kind of freedom, right? A God-given freedom for searching for the final questions of humans, right? That kind of theological and teleological picture is not the kind of juridical view that we find in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment is a very contingent document. It's a legal document. It does not have, as it were, metaphysical principles attached to it, right? So, with all those caveats aside, I do think the American experiment does provide some interesting creative or imagination, a kind of historical imagination for Catholics beyond America to consider the ways in which a juridical separation of church and state that's still cooperative, right? This is not the laicite view of a kind of naked public square on the one hand, or a strict, sort of confessional unified state on the other, right? This kind of cooperative but jurisdictionally separate church and state view has provided some unique benefits. And I think the American experiment shows what those benefits are and was part of the thinking at the Second Vatican Council. I don't think John Courtney Murray's advising and thought won the day, but I think it was an important contribution to that discussion. But again, we have to recognize the way in which, if we want to look at the sort of the continuity of church teaching, the way in which the church has maintained that church-state unity is the ideal, and the way in which American Catholics have argued otherwise.
This one is from Enslaved by Truth. What is your opinion on Dr. Rowe's theories on Locke and Calvinism influence on the United States?
So I'm not intimately familiar with his view of Locke and Calvinism on the United States, but generally speaking, when people look at Locke's influence, they find his influence in terms of a kind of political philosophy, right? Of government defined by a kind of representation model where people, as it were, give up some of their rights or deliberation right for the security that the state provides, but then secures those natural rights, and that's the whole point of government, right? And that furthermore, they see Locke's influence in religious liberty when Locke talks about religious toleration. He's effectively arguing something that isn't the case during his time, which is that other Protestant dissenters should be tolerated, right, and given sort of more or less full liberties, and that people have argued is the foundation of religious liberty in America. That is to say, this view that state should not be involved in coercing people right towards faith can be found in American religious liberty laws. I think Locke's influence is justified. I think he did have an influence on several of the founders, some of the more important ones, but it's probably been exaggerated as well. That is to say, if we take Locke on his face, then Catholics should not be tolerated, because Locke says quite explicitly in his documents on toleration that Catholics should not be tolerated because they deliver themselves up to a foreign prince, right, the Pope. And so John Locke is aware of conciliarist arguments and yet rejects them. He basically sees them as half Catholics. He calls them false Catholics, right? Those who can separate the Pope's power in that way. And so if one wants to argue that Locke had an influence on religious liberty, I think one needs to give an account of how Catholics were given that liberty, right? And so what I show is that although Locke had an influence, the American founders were willing to believe, unlike Locke, that Catholics were genuinely separating papal authority in ways that they could still remain Catholic. And so that's where I depart with sort of the standard Lockean view.
Jack Slay asks, what would you say is the position, or to the position, that it is only the federal government, even after the passage of the 14th Amendment, that is prohibited from establishing a religion?
Yeah, so this is a kind of federalist view of the First Amendment. That is to say, if you look at the text of the First Amendment, it says Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? And so that's Congress, that's U.S. Congress. And so if you say, well, the First Amendment is incorporated in the state constitutions via the 14th Amendment incorporation doctrine, then it's a nonsense, right? Because the text is Congress shall pass no law, right? And so what does the states have to do with that, right? And so people have basically said, well, it's the kind of spirit, right, of that. That is to say, the political authority, the legislative authority, or the political authority generally, should not establish a church, right? And that includes states. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that historically speaking, the U.S. Constitution was ratified when there were state-established churches, right? And the last state-established church continued until the 1830s. So it's clear to me that a kind of original meaning of the First Amendment Establishment Clause is that state-established churches are permissible. That is to say, the First Amendment says nothing about them one way or the other. It's left to the states. And that's the kind of federalist view, that if the federal government doesn't have anything to say about it, right, that power or that question rests in the states and the people. And so, but with the 14th Amendment incorporation clause, we have, effectively a jurisprudence that says no government entity, whether a state, legislature, or a municipality, right, or a school board, or whatever kind of political authority you're talking about, can't, well, what is it, right? This is exactly what the kind of case law constantly goes back and forth on. Can't establish a religion? Well, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean it can't have school prayer, right? Okay, if it can't have school prayer, then what about a kind of general prayer about God? In other words, it can't just be a particular God, like it can't be invoke Jesus, or it can't talk about Allah or something like that. No, it has to be no prayer whatsoever. What about a moment of silence? Oh, well, maybe that's okay, right? So we have all these debates about what establishment of religion means, but I think to your listener's question, I think there is a sense here that originally speaking, it was meant to only be a kind of federal provision.
Jedediah asks, what is your opinion on the books Catholic Republic in America on Trial?
Okay, good. So these are contemporary books that sort of approach some of the questions we've been talking about in different ways. I'll just take one of them. So America on Trial argues, in effect, that the American founding was well-founded, right? And although not everything was perfect at the founding, namely questions of slavery and other grave injustices, it had, as it were, the seedbeds for its own reform, and provided the kind of principles that are compatible with sort of a kind of natural law, a natural right perspective, right? That is very much compatible with ultimately a Catholic view of political theology, as it were. Look, I'm generally sympathetic with views that show American Catholic compatibility, or a bit more modestly, sort of the compatibility of natural law thinking with the American founding. I think as an historian, it's an incredibly complex question, and it can slice two or three different ways, right? One is at the level of straight theory, right? Political philosophy, right? And the ways in which sort of Catholic social teaching and documents about religious exercise and church establishment and all the rest, whether that comports with the American experiment or not. But it's the second question about sort of, as it were, practicalities, or what's in the realm of possible. The possible. Politics is art of the possible. And I think on that level, I'm much more sympathetic, the second. That is to say, if you take a look at, again, historically speaking, the way in which Catholicism has sort of greatly waned in previously confessional state countries, and then the way in which Catholicism continues to, in many ways, thrive in places like the United States, I think you can attribute a lot of that growth, and a lot of the problems, of course, but a lot of the growth and creativity in the American Catholic Church to the fact that church state has been juridically separated, but still allowed to be cooperative, right? So I think that's the kind of general sense in which I would agree with Riley's America on Trial, for instance. I think there is a sense here that if you look at the Constitution, they do respect sort of some natural law principles, right? To take, for instance, the late Michael Novak's argument. He was a neighbor and a dear friend of mine before he passed. His comment, Michael Novak's comment about the way in which copyright law, right, in the Constitution, is a great manifestation of this view that human creativity should be rewarded, right, and that we all sort of cooperate and with God's creative act. I think that's a clever kind of way of thinking about the way in which American law, although on its face has nothing to do with Catholicism by any stretch, but the way in which Catholics can see into it with the eyes of faith, ways in which the American experiment does allow us to really, I think, flourish in a country like this.
Read Me asks, how is it possible to not see the U.S. Constitution as an inherently anti-Catholic document, as it established the United States as first secular state and thus denies the kingship of Christ?
Yeah, it's a very powerfully question.
Yeah.
Question. It's now off the screen. So if I had that right, I guess I would want to interrogate some of the premises. So first is whether it's an inherently secular state. I think on its surface that's right. That is to say, it's not an established church arrangement. It does not invoke God except to say in the year of our Lord, right? It does not provide a kind of confession of the true faith in the way that confessional states often would, say Spain or France. At the same time, I don't see it as anti-religious or even anti-Catholic or anti-Christian either. And so in some ways, you might call it a kind of neutral document. Now, the problem with saying that from, I think that the standpoint of your listener is there is no neutrality on the question, right? You either sort of believe in Christ or you don't, and you either have a confessional state or you don't. And I think what the American Project is sort of questioning is whether you have to have that level of specificity, right, in politics, right? And so if you take the kind of high view coming from, say, Aquinas' De Regno, his letter to the Cypriot king, then the end of politics is the politics, as Father James Shaw said, the politics of heaven or hell, right? I mean, the end of government is not just to provide peace and security of government, of your people in government, but to get as far as possible, your subjects, in the case of a king, to heaven, right? That's the ultimate goal. And obviously, the king will use means appropriate to temporal authorities to conduce to people's salvation, as opposed to the priestly means. But nonetheless, would do all sorts of sort of practical things, like confess the true faith, like perhaps create mandatory tithing, outlaw business activity on this Christian Sabbath, and so on and so on. I think the great question that the American experiment asks us as Catholics is, do we need to get to that level of specificity? And I'm not even arguing, for instance, that the confessional state would be coercive necessarily. It could have a kind of toleration regime of non-Catholics. And if we understand politics as the art of the possible, then we might be led to say, as Leo XIII says in Immortality Dei, when the conditions are not right, and I'm paraphrasing here, but when the conditions aren't right, when you don't have a leader that's Catholic, for instance, or leaders that aren't Catholic, or the population, in other words, when sort of the on-the-ground facts militate against, right, having a confessional state, then it's licit. And I think that's, I think that's a reasonable view to hold. That, look, okay, it doesn't rise to the level of the ideal, but it doesn't have to in this side of salvation. So I think that would be a kind of argument in favor of the U.S. Constitution from a high papalist, confessional state view. Like, we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about sort of theory and practice. And I don't know if that satisfies your listener, but I think that's ultimately what I think an American Catholic would have to hold, unless they reject the metaphysical picture of church-state unity, which would be an interesting debate. But
well, Dr. Breidenbach, this has been fascinating. I've learned a lot. A lot of this stuff is new to me. So this is really interesting. I'm definitely going to be getting a copy of your book and reading it. And I encourage everybody else to get a copy. It's our DearBought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America. And again, I have a link to it there in the description. Like I said, go and get you a copy. Dr. Breidenbach, you're welcome on the show anytime. This was great.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation.
I really enjoyed it. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. As I always say, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Especially check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology to support us and what we're doing here, and also to get access to extra content and, behind the scenes, all kinds of good stuff. So, all right, that's going to do it. Till next time. God bless you all.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the